I don't talk about what happened on the Appalachian Trail, not even to my closest hiking buddies. But there is one thing I have to mention. No human being, not even someone running for their life, can make a sound like that. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was a drawn-out, high-pitched vocalization that seemed to scrape the air right out of the ancient forests of Maine. It happened on my 38th day on the trail, and to this day, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the way the sound twisted the silence. The year was 2018, and I was doing a section hike through the most remote part of the 100-mile wilderness. I'm Marc, an IT guy from Boston, but out there, I was just a speck of sweat and determination. I'd planned this trip for months, meticulously packing my lightweight gear, charting my water sources, and coordinating food drops. My goal was simple: disconnect. For the first few weeks, it was everything I'd hoped for, the kind of profound solitude only deep American wilderness can offer. The only sounds were the wind in the hemlocks and the rhythmic thud of my trekking poles. I set up my camp near a small, unnamed pond on the fourth night out. It was a perfect spot, flat ground, a good view of the stars, and the smell of clean, cold water. But as dusk settled, I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no chirping, no rustling, no owls. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was a vast, heavy, and unnatural absence of noise, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I attributed it to the sheer remoteness, zipped up my tent, and tried to fall asleep, telling myself I was being paranoid. Just a city guy, unnerved by real quiet. The silence broke just after midnight. I was jerked awake by what felt like a sudden drop in air pressure. The only thing I could discern was a faint, sour smell, like stale copper and wet earth, hanging just outside my tent mesh. Then the sounds began. It started with heavy, measured footsteps circling my tent knot, the lumbering walk of a bear, but a steady bipedal stride, like a man walking in deep concentration. I froze, clutching the small bottle of bear spray. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" My voice sounded pathetically thin. The footsteps stopped instantly. The quiet rushed back in, but now it was thick with expectation. A moment later, a new noise started, a slow, rhythmic thump, thump, ... thump, coming from the trees about 50 yards away. It sounded like something large, heavy, and soft, hitting the trunk of a tree, over and over. I strained my eyes against the darkness, but my headlamp was still off, and I was too terrified to turn it on, convinced it would only give away my position. The thumping went on for a solid 5 minutes, each impact vibrating subtly through the cold ground and into my sleeping pad, making my teeth ache. I thought maybe a deer was thrashing its antlers, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too intentional. Finally, it ceased. What replaced it was worse. The low, guttural whispering began, coming from directly above my tent. It wasn't English, or any language I could recognize. It was a collection of wet, clicking, and rasping sounds too fast to be a real conversation, like two people arguing underwater. I realized two things at that moment. Whatever was out there was tall, impossibly tall, and it wasn't just observing me. It was toying with me. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to tear itself free. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the soft, shifting weight above, until the first gray hints of dawn began to smudge the east. The moment the sun's light touched the campsite, the whispering stopped, and the heavy footfalls moved away. Not quickly, but with a deliberate, unsettling slowness, finally dissolving into the deep cover of the Maine woods. I didn't wait. The second the sun cleared the horizon, I tore down my camp, throwing everything into my pack with panicked efficiency. I started speed hiking south, pushing myself to an exhausting pace. I didn't stop for a real break until I'd covered 15 miles. As I slumped down near a stream to filter water, I noticed a track. It was on the muddy bank, fresh and undeniable. It was enormous, at least 16 inches long, and distinctly humanoid, but the arch was impossibly high, and the toes were splayed at odd angles, as if the creature had been walking on ground it wasn't built for. I snapped a quick, blurry photo with my phone, the evidence I needed to confirm I hadn't lost my mind. Then I heard it again, the sound I mentioned at the start. It came from the ridge above me, close to close. It was that chilling, drawn-out vocalization. A sound that started like a low moan and peaked in a terrifying, high-frequency shriek that didn't sound like it needed lungs to be created. It was pure sonic malice. I didn't see the thing. I didn't need to. The sound alone was enough to trigger a primal, biological terror that emptied my mind of everything but the absolute need to flee. I scrambled up the bank, dropping my filter and not looking back, running blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline, until I hit the boundary of the national forest and the paved road of a nearby town. I never finished the section. I called my wife from the first payphone I could find in town, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. I told her I had an injury, an excuse that felt thin, even to my own ears. That photo of the track is still on my old phone, and I pull it up sometimes, late at night. I can't explain it. The Forest Service will tell you it was a bear, or a hoax, or a man, but I know what I heard and what I felt, an ancient, cold intelligence watching me from the dark canopy, a predator that wasn't looking for food, but for something far more disturbing. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment in Boston, I can almost smell that sour copper scent again, a phantom reminder that some things in the American wilderness are meant to remain untouched and unseen. The Pacific Northwest coast is a beautiful place to disappear. I learned that the hard way. It wasn't the fog, or the cold, or the jagged rocks that scared me the most. It was the deep, patient way the ocean waited to reclaim anything that came. To close, but there's a reason nobody takes a fishing vessel out of Astoria, Oregon, and heads for those particular coordinates off the coast of the Olympic Peninsula anymore. It has something to do with what the waves bring in, and the terrible silence that follows. My name is Finn, and I was running an independent scallop dredger, the Maria, a few years ago. I loved the isolation. I was completely alone, hundreds of miles from shore, with nothing but the low-engine drone for company. The seafloor in that area is notoriously tricky, deep canyons and sudden seamounts, but the scallop beds are untouched and worth the risk. My first week was profitable and uneventful. However, on the 8th night, the weather turned odd. The storm wasn't violent. It was silent. The waves rose huge and black, but they made no breaking sound, just a slow, sickening heave and drop of the hull. And then I saw it floating on the water. A deer, a large buck, perfectly preserved, floating upside down. Its coat was dark, and its body was stiff. I figured it had been washed out during a river swell, but as the Maria drifted closer, I saw that its legs weren't tucked. They were tied to a heavy-looking, dark gray stone using lengths of thick, new-looking nylon rope. I stared at it for a long minute. A deer, tied to a rock, miles from land, in the middle of the Pacific. It was too intentional, too unsettling to ignore, a bizarre piece of unsettling debris that definitely wasn't local. I cut the engine and let the boat rock, deciding to leave it alone. That's when the smell hit me. Not brine, but something medicinal and sharp, like iodine mixed with burnt sugar, which momentarily overwhelmed the salty air. After seeing the deer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned away from the stern, I felt a heavy, cold weight settle on my back. the incidents escalated subtly. My gear started acting up. My primary GPS went completely blank, showing my position as a floating error message that read, "Only null point." Then, one morning, I found a series of tiny, perfectly formed spirals drawn in the condensation on my wheelhouse window. They weren't smeared or drawn by a finger. They were etched with a precise, almost microscopic care, as if done by the tip of a needle. I wiped them away, my hands shaking. Later that afternoon, I was working the dredge wire, pulling in a haul, when I heard a distinct thunk on the hole directly below me. It was too light to be debris and too metallic to be a fish. I peered over the side. The water was a black, churning mirror. I saw nothing. Then, about 10 yards out, something surfaced briefly. It was only visible for a second, a pale, slick shape that looked too long and too smooth to be a seal or a porpoise. It sank instantly, leaving behind a series of small, concentric rings on the surface that quickly vanished. What horrified me was the glimpse I caught of its hand. Not a fin, but something with fingers long, pale, and unnaturally articulated. I rushed back inside and locked the wheelhouse door, something I hadn't done in 10 years of solo sailing. I started drinking coffee and staring out at the water, convinced that whatever was out there was circling, playing a slow, deliberate game. All night, the low thumping returned, tapping against the fiberglass hull, sometimes high up near the bow, sometimes low near the keel, sounding like a constant, gentle inquiry. The climax came around 3 a.m., in the absolute dead center of the night. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a sound that made the hairs stand up on my neck, a wet, rhythmic scraping coming from the port side of the boat, right where the dredge machinery was lowered. It sounded like fingernails dragging across the steel cable, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flare gun and crept to the small window facing the port side. The water was black and endless. I slowly lifted the flare gun, ready to fire it for light. As I did, a sound came from the deck directly above my head, a loud, heavy drag, followed by the unmistakable sound of something weightly sliding across the metal decking toward the wheelhouse door. I dropped the flare gun, my breath catching in. Mice wrote. Whatever it was on the boat. It wasn't creeping. It was massive and heavy, and its weight was making the old wood below me creak in protest. The sound paused right outside the door, and then a series of quick, hard raps hammered the metal not like knuckles, but like heavy bone. I pressed my back against the wall, eyes wide, waiting for the wood to splinter. Then, a low, rasping sigh seemed to enter the cabin, a sound of heavy, cold exhalation that smelled intensely of that chemical iodine and wet earth. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, an eternity of pure, freezing dread, before the sound of the heavy, dragging weight moved again, heading toward the stern and slipping silently back into the dark Pacific. I immediately started the engines, not caring about the position of the dredge or the risk of fouling the props. I throttled the Maria to her absolute limit, pointing the bow straight east towards the distant lights of Astoria. I sailed for 12 hours without stopping, without sleeping, only looking ahead. I abandoned the dredge cable and all the expensive equipment. When I finally hit port, I sold the Maria for scrap the next day and never set foot on the Pacific again. All I have left is the persistent memory of that overwhelming, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of something heavy dragging itself across my deck, checking to see if the door was locked. Sometimes, I swear I can still feel the cold, heavy weight of whatever was watching me from the deep, just settling on my shoulders. I used to think the deepest, darkest secrets of this country were hidden underground, in forgotten mine shafts or old military bunkers. But I was wrong. The truly unsettling things are hiding in plain sight, just off the interstate, in the desolate stretches of the Nevada desert. They wait in the places where the electricity runs, but the people don't, and they listen to the silence. And sometimes they send things back. My story takes place just outside of Area 51, not on the military base, but miles north, near a remote substation that fed power to a handful of ranches. My job was straightforward. I was an independent contractor, running utility surveys, checking the integrity of ancient power lines that crisscross the empty lands. This was back in '09. I'd set up my dilapidated Airstream trailer 50 miles from the nearest town, near the junction of two major lines. The days were blistering, the nights freezing, and the solitude was complete. The only weird thing I encountered initially was the sheer quantity of animal bones. I kept finding near the base of the biggest transmission towers not scattered remains, but neat, disturbing piles of bleached coyote and rabbit skeletons. I chalked it up to coyotes using the towers for high ground, but it still felt unsettlingly deliberate. The real disturbance began on my third night. The air was dead still. I was trying to sleep when my old CB radio, which I always kept tuned, 2 emergency frequencies, hissed to life with a sudden, loud burst of static. Then, a voice cut through, clear as a bell, speaking in a low, monotone chant. It wasn't a distress call. It was a man's voice, mechanically reciting a series of numbers and geological coordinates. The sound itself was sterile and cold, but the content made my blood run cold. The coordinates the voice was reading were extremely close, maybe a quarter mile from my trailer, directly under the tallest set of high-tension wires. I fumbled for my flashlight and ran outside, scanning the moonlit desert scrub. I saw nothing. When I came back in, the voice was gone, replaced by the normal, quiet hiss of the static, leaving me wondering if the extreme isolation was finally getting to my head. The next few days were a masterclass in slow, grinding paranoia. The recitation returned every night, always between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., always from a different point on the radio dial, cycling through frequencies that should have been dead air. Then, the desert itself started to change. I noticed it first in the dirt around my trailer. There were distinct drag marks, long and straight, that ran from the base of the nearest transmission tower right up to the front wheel of my Airstream. Whatever made them wasn't small. The marks were wide and deep. I tried to follow them into the scrub, but they vanished 30 feet in. I started sleeping with my rifle propped against my bed, no longer afraid of human trespassers, but of something far more inexplicable. I began meticulously checking the ground every sunset and every sunrise. The marks would reappear, sometimes crossing, sometimes running parallel, but always touching the trailer. The absolute worst instance was when I found a small, smooth, dark gray stone sitting squarely on my windshield. It wasn't local rock. It was polished and looked wet, even in the dry desert air, and wrapped around it was a single, long strand of dark, human hair. The climax occurred during the day. I was checking an insulator a mile from my camp when my radio equipment suddenly flared up, not with static, but with a terrifying, constant screaming tona sound too high and unnatural for any known radio interference. It hurt my ears and made my teeth vibrate. I ripped the headset off. As I did, I glanced up at the nearest tower. About halfway up the lattice structure, crouched impossibly on one of the horizontal crossbeams, was a figure. It was incredibly slender, seemingly naked, and unnaturally white, with limbs that appeared too long for its torso. It wasn't moving, just huddled there, staring directly at me with a posture that suggested intense, predatory focus. I dropped. My clipboard had started scrambling backward, trying not to take my eyes off it. That's when the wind picked up, a sudden, brutal gust that smelled strongly of ozone and burnt metal. The high-tension wires above the tower began to whine. As I watched, the figure slowly, agonizingly, began to unfold itself, its joints clicking, audibly even over the roaring wind. It rose to an impossible height, its head tilting to one side, like a curious bird of prey. But its attention was locked solely on me. I didn't wait for it to descend. I turned and ran back to my airstream, sprinting faster than I thought possible, not looking back until I dove inside and locked the door. Throwing my heavy toolcase against it for good measure, I spent the next hour lying on the floor, listening to the high-pitched electric whine of the power lines. I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't even bother breaking down my camp. I started the truck, hooked up the airstream, and tore out of the desert dust, leaving everything behind, including thousands of dollars of specialized equipment. I drove straight through the night until I hit Arizona. I never reported the figure or the coordinates. I know it was using the electrical grid, the empty power of the desert, as its hunting ground. I sold my truck and my trailer a week later, needing to be as far away from the desolate, electrically charged silence as possible. And sometimes, when I stand near a large transformer or high-tension line, I can feel the faint, cold pressure building behind my eyes, and I remember the impossible, towering white figure, watching me from the electric bones of the Nevada wilderness.